This week, we welcome Gene Kim, founder, researcher, and author of The Phoenix Project and the recently released The Unicorn Project, to talk about his goals and aspirations in The Unicorn Project. We'll talk about the 5 ideals, DevOps, and a lot of the characters. We're going to do a spoiler segment as well, so we'll give everyone a heads up. I don't want to spoil it for those that have it on their reading list. In our second segment, we welcome back Peter Smith, co-founder of Edgewise, to talk about stopping Python backdoor attacks and how similar attacks have managed to evade traditional network security defenses and propagate inside their target environments. In the security news, NHS alerted to severe vulns in GE Health equipment. Ragnarok ransomware targets Citrix ADC and disables Windows Defender. Suspected MageCart hackers arrested in Indonesia. Wawa data breach was found for sale. And a mega breach that exposed more than 250 million users. All that and more on this episode of Paul's Security Weekly.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where exploits run wild, packets aren't the only things getting sniffed, and the cocktails flow steady. It's Paul's Security Weekly. The question is simple. Have any of the systems on my network been compromised? The answer is harder than it should be. Enter AI Hunter. Active Countermeasures has automated and streamlined techniques used by the best pen testers and threat hunters in the industry to create AI Hunter, a network threat hunting solution that does the first pass of a hunt for you to identify systems that are most likely to be compromised and scores the results on a scale from 0 to 100. You can then research those systems in depth with AI Hunter. Focus your valuable time on the systems that need your expertise with AI Hunter. Sign up for a personal demo today at securityweekly.com/ACM. This message is brought to you by Spirion. The data privacy revolution is the new age of protecting what matters most. Automatically and persistently discover and classify sensitive data with the most accurate solution on the planet. Understand the data within the context of your business and then take actions to control that data so you can operate with minimal friction and comply with the laws and regulations built to protect the personal data privacy of individuals across the globe. This is Spirion, protecting what matters most. Visit them on the web at securityweekly.com/Spirion.
And welcome to the show. But first, let me introduce you to a man who is so excited you can smell it. Good thing, because if you're in the studio, you can taste it. Mr. Paul Asadorian.
Welcome to Paul's Security Weekly. It's episode number 637, recorded on January 30th, 2020, right here in G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island. To my left, I've got some folks here in the studio. Mr. Matt Alderman is here with us. Matt, welcome.
I am. It's been 6 weeks, so finally I showed up.
About time.
That's awesome.
Time.
Mr. Larry Pesci is here with us. Larry, welcome.
Yeah. Had a week off as it were. Went to Seattle for work, and good times were had.
Nice.
Lots of good fun things coming up for Wild West Hackin' Fest in San Diego.
Oh yeah,
I'm
that's
doing
right.
that.
Yeah.
I'm going to be talking.
Good. Peter Smith from Edgewise is here. Peter, welcome.
Oh, good to be here.
That's awesome. Now, are you doing the Wild West Hackin' Fest the West or the...
Yeah, the West.
West,
Yeah,
okay.
Way
going
West.
to-
Way
going
West.
to-
Way West.
Yep.
Way West.
Way West Hackin' Fest. Yep.
Awesome.
Mike Poor and I are keynoting.
Yes, you're
On,
co-keynoting.
Yes, time travel and GPS fuckery.
Ooh.
Oh, with asterisks in the fuckery part.
Gotcha.
Fuckery
In the GPS part.
Yeah. Right. Yep.
Mr. Jeff Mann is here with us. Jeff, welcome.
Greetings, glad to be back, as always.
And Mr. Lee Neely. Lee, welcome.
Good to be here. Good to be joining everybody for a little fun after not being able to successfully connect last week.
Yes, nice to have you on the show this evening. Make sure you join us at InfoSec World 2020, March 30th through April 1st at Disney's Contemporary Resort. Matt and I will be hosting a Container Security Day. Security Weekly will be there on the show floor, also conducting interviews if you're interested in sponsoring an interview where we sit down with folks and figure out what they do and highlight that in interviews that will air on our shows and on our YouTube channel. You can contact us for that. Our listeners get 15% off the InfoSec World main conference or a World Pass by visiting securityweekly.com/ISW 2020. Our guest for this evening, it's been a while since Gene has been on the show. Of course, Gene Kim is a multiple award-winning CTO and researcher. And many of you have probably at least heard about and probably read the Phoenix Project. The Unicorn Project is a new book by Gene Kim, one that I just finished along with my children. I don't think I've told you this, Gene, but my three boys, 11, 6, and 3, listened to most of it. They were sad when it ended. It's a resounding thumbs up from the Asadorian family, so much so the 3-year-old told the 6-year-old, "Shh, I'm listening, trying to listen to the book. Keep quiet." That's how much they liked it. So, Gene, welcome to the program.
Oh my gosh, so great to be here, and I'm still I'm getting over that incredible raving reviews from your kids. I love it, and congratulations on a kick butt 2019, and here's to a even more exciting 2020.
Absolutely. So, Gene, what was, and I phrase this purposely, what was the goal when you set out to write this book?
The puns.
Yeah,
The puns.
Yeah. No, I love it. So the Unicorn Project was based in the same timeline as the Phoenix Project, and I think there are 3 reasons that really drove me to write the Unicorn Project. One is I think there's this absence of understanding of all the invisible structures that are required to enable developers to be productive, and some would call that architecture. But that's and it's difficult to explain. And it's something that I think is very, very important too. Is there's other problem that I think is huge. So the DevOps community rightly and famously pointed out how difficult it was to get code to where it needed to go, which is in production, so that customers get that value. There's this other problem around data. Data is often trapped in systems of records, data warehouse, and it takes weeks, months, and quarters for it to get to where it needs to go, which is in the hands of developers and people who use and manipulate data in their daily work. And that's like a third to a half of all organizational employees. And then third, there's this problem that I think there's strong oppositions from people to support these newer ways of working, whether you call it DevOps or not. And it comes from operations, information security, compliance, audit, developers. And so I just really wanted to explore kind of how, in what ways does that sort of show up, and what are better ways that leadership can support initiatives that, I think are so important for the survival of almost every organization on the planet.
It's interesting, Gene, when I listened to you talk, it really underscored the lesson of how important environments are. And even with the technologies that we have today, such as containers and Docker, the data is still a requirement. I still need some kind of data, like somewhere in the system, right? And in my test systems. And to get that data, you may have to go through compliance and all these other mechanisms, right?
Yeah, I love what as someone said, it's like, kind of the best, most fun ideas are the ones that are contrarian, controversial, and so forth. And I think DevOps is always that, right? It's kind of this inversion of what the common wisdom is versus things that we know to be true. And one of them is like environments, right? The where people put their attention is on the feature, right? That's what's so important. That's where you get budget and funding for. You can hold the app, and so any idiot can get budget for that. But the things underneath that are all the APIs, the backend systems, and then underneath that are all the tools that developers use in their daily work. And it's so hard to get funding for those things. And environments are such a great example of that. They're so boring. Everyone knows what they are, and no one can get one. And it takes weeks, months, or quarters. And to do work correctly and actually expect it to work when you get into production, you need those. So,
right. But it also underscored a point that could be someone else's problem. One of the, I think, most troubling things for me in reading the book was, the programmer in their hacker hoodie that, I won't spoil it. We'll get to spoilers, but like while there was chaos, that person was working his 9 to 5 in his hoodie, writing code, checking it in. Like, I don't know, like deployment and testing, that's someone else's problem. That was kind of scary.
Problem.
Right?
And I think one of another controversial thing about DevOps is this notion of developers doing their own testing and doing their own deployments, and God forbid, actually having access to the production environment and
right.
Potentially fixing things, right? And it sounds immoral, right? It sounds irresponsible, and yet I think to support these kind of new ways of working, where Amazon's doing 136,000 deployments per day. Every engineer is able to quickly and independently develop and test and deliver value to their customers independently without having to communicate, coordinate, be beholden to by take people out to lunch, right? They can do it by themselves, and the massive competitive advantage that creates is so compelling. Amazon spent over $1 billion refactoring their internal system so that they could decouple the famous Abidos system. Anyone familiar with Amazon URLs, right? Well, remember the Abidos link. So Abidos was a single point where all the display logic, all the business rules, all the pricing and promotion was in there, and no one could change it because it would always blow up. And so that was the famous genesis of the 2002 memo that Jeff Bezos said, the only way that teams can communicate with each other is through hard networked APIs, right? As a way to decouple these teams from each other. So and it's not to say that they don't have to do security. On the contrary, they are solely responsible for availability and security, and I think it ends up with far better outcomes for everybody.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting pieces you brought up in your third point was some of the internal stuff. Think about things like change control, right? Yeah. That's a big hurdle to get over in a DevOps world because we're so used to
Gene's laughing because boy, does that come to life in the book.
And so you've got you've got compliance and all these requirements around change control, and you can't make changes to a production system. DevOps just completely blows that up.
Yes. That's very good examples of that, both working and not in the book, right? All of the hurdles that. So I want to back up for a moment, Gene. Who should read this book?
Oh, that's a great question. So every time you write a book, one of the most important things to do is identify who your audience is, and it's absolutely the same for products as well. And so the Phoenix Project was really aimed at operations leadership. I think there was a kind of an aspiration that it would be read by the CIO and the CIO's boss, maybe. In the Unicorn Project, one of the toughest choices was to say that the audience, the real audience that the book is targeted towards, is the person doing development in the daily work, right? That is a line developer, I'm so proud of the impact the Phoenix Project had in terms of how people talk about technology. And it was kind of tough to be able to say, well, I want this book to be read by leadership too. So the real hope was that the book was be good enough so that every engineer loves it, which means that engineering leadership has to read it, which means that hopefully business leadership will read it. And so I think that's a tougher and harder slog. But the reason I made that decision was that I think if the book was for technology leadership, then we couldn't have brought up all of the ideas around, architecture and, IDE. In fact, the reason it came to the forefront when the editor says you have to spell out what IDEs are. It's like, my God, no way. The audience will know what an IDE is. And so that's what really caused me to double down and say, all right, this is for the developer. And we're not going to go to extraordinary lengths to explain some of these concepts.
Sure. Now, do you have to read the Phoenix Project first?
You absolutely do not. In fact, that was one of my biggest anxieties for the 3 years working on the book, and it came up over and over. More evidence that says, it's fine. In fact, there was actually a lot of the early reviewers. They were so stressed out that they read the Phoenix Project first. I'm like, no. It's like so. There was a whole page that says you do not need to reread the Phoenix Project. It stands on itself. If anything is so important that you need to know, I, as the author, will remind you.
Right. Now, my next question was should you read it? Obviously, your answer is yes. And I agree with that. But let me take it to a third party. If you've read the Phoenix Project, you don't have to reread it, right? Because, like Gene said, it sets it up. But I think you should read the Phoenix Project first before the Unicorn Project because it gives you the background on some of the characters. And I think had I not read it first, I wouldn't have gotten as much out of the characters and the dynamic as I did. So I recommend Phoenix Project first, then Unicorn Project. But don't go reread it. You don't have to. I mean, if you want to. Yeah.
In fact, and that's a relief to hear. But I think I did work really hard to make sure that it could stand on its own. And holy cow, I can't tell you what a pain in the ass it is to write a book following a timeline that you wrote, 6 years ago. It's like a spreadsheet that I created, to basically make sure I didn't break canon. And then all the and the editors found a whole bunch of mistakes I made. I mean, it is really, really tough. There's a whole bunch of creative constraints as well, as you can imagine.
So why is it called the Unicorn Project, or does that give away too much?
No. In fact, the Unicorn Project actually showed up in the Phoenix Project, where it was so clear that in order to kind of ensure the company's survival, the Phoenix project was not the answer, right? You couldn't deploy it without it blowing up the entire organization. And so they just in the Phoenix project, it did describe the small team that decoupled itself from the mothership and were able to do all these amazing things, and created a little rebellion inside of the large ancient existing order. And so what was like about 20 pages in the Phoenix project, it got is now an entire book. And it really is a story about rebellion, about how people who really cared about the long-term interests of the organization and the customers they served, how they were willing to break the rules and find ways to skirt regulations, and not regulations in terms of contractual obligations or policy regulations, but all
just
of the
security and compliance.
Right. And
I mean, some of that in it as well. Yeah, certainly. But
so this group of rebels did include a security engineer, Shannon, which was one of my favorite characters.
Yeah, Shannon's awesome. Although my favorite character,
also fictitious, Paul.
Also fictitious. My favorite character is Maxine, of course. That character is definitely my hero from this book. What were your inspirations for the Maxine character? Because the book spends a lot of time.
He really wants to meet Maxine.
I do.
I think Paul's fantasizing about Maxine.
Yeah, Maxine is awesome, right? I mean, she's a senior engineer, right, in her mid-40s, and people on Twitter, right, they said that she's actually a very intimidating character, right, because she's done operations, she's done information security, she's fought DDoS attacks, she's evacuated denizators when they were on fire and flooding, right, and she's a functional programmer, and and
she likes to say, "I'm really good at this stuff," and it's believable in the story, right? The way you painted her background, right?
Yeah, and she's almost like a superhero, right? And the reason why she's set up that way is that as good as she was, right, you put her in the middle of the Phoenix project, and she can't do anything. Right? She, what she should be able to do, like do a build, do a test, write a test, see if it works in a production-like environment. She cannot, right? She's like, I think in my mental model of it was like Tom Hanks in the movie Castaway, like height of her powers, and yet is like stranded in this desolate technical debt waste of the Phoenix project. And so it's just in many ways. So she was constructed as an incredibly capable person, just to make sure that everyone realized that without the right environments, without the right technical practices, without the right cultural norms, even the best engineers cannot get the most important work done. And so that was. And to directly answer your question, there are many people that she's modeled on. Courtney Kissler, she's an executive at Nike. Mike Nygaard, who wrote the Release It book. Scott Havens, who was at a company who got acquired by Walmart. I mean, these are all just Cornelia Davis, who's at Pivotal. These people who have just incredible technical judgment, as well as a lot of understanding of how business works. Maxine really represents, I think, the best in the game.
What are the 5 ideals?
Yeah, the 5. So in the Phoenix project, we had the 3 ways, which were meant as the principles of which you can derive all of the DevOps principles and practices from. And so the equivalent of that in the Unicorn project is the 5 ideals, and they're just things that I think are really important. And so the first ideal is locality and simplicity. So it really, if you had to boil it down to a number, it's like, when you need to get something done, how many people do you need to take out to lunch? Is it the Amazon ideal of the 2 pizza team? Or do you have to take out the entire building, right? And so, where it could be hundreds. And so, like, even testing, right? Can you test on your laptop? Or do you have to test in an integrated test environment, of which there aren't enough of, right? And no one cleans them up, right? And so it's all about to what extent can teams independently develop and test, secure, and deploy value to customers.
Now, does the TEP-LARB play into that first ideal as a barrier?
Yeah, for sure, right? It's like when you have to get permission from everybody, including the mighty Technology Evaluation Process Lead Architecture Review Board, the TEP-LARB, that's modeled after the Target TEP-LARB back before they abolished it.
So the TEP-LARB was a real thing in a real company. It wasn't just a word you made up, because I tried to run it backwards and stuff. I thought it was something you made up. It was a coded message.
No. There was actually, in fact, that story came from Heather Mickman, the senior director of development at Target, who, due to her endless lobbying, finally abolished it after 20 years in existence.
Right. And it was basically this board, right? Like if you had an idea to introduce a new technology, you had to take it to this board, and they, they might consider it, and then we'll reconvene in 6 months to see if you can implement this new technology.
Because that's moving fast,
right?
Yeah, that's being innovative.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, in fact, I mean, what I love about it is like who's on it, right? It's your 2 dev architects, 2 enterprise architects on one end of the table, and then the other end of the table you have the 2 ops architects and the 2 security architects, right? And then they start peppering you with questions, then they start arguing with each other, and then they say, "Come back in 60 days, and we will reconsider your proposal."
So that's the first ideal.
Yeah, the first ideal, right? And so that the outcome, I think, is the second ideal of focus, flow, and joy. And I found now that I've fallen back in love with development is that it just made me realize how much I love coding. And so when you can do the work that you need to do, when you can throw your best energies into solving the business problem, as opposed to dealing with meetings and TEPLARBs and security reviews and change control boards, you have a state of flow. And so Dr. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, he gave the best TED Talk of all time, and he said, "Flow is a state of which you are enjoying your work so much you lose track of time and maybe even sense of self." And I think anyone in technology, we know what that feels like, and I think that is what the environment, when great organizations enable every engineer to be in that state of flow. And I can personally attest to like how great it is when you can achieve flow, and like how badly you want to get it back when you lose flow.
Paul knows that all too well.
Yeah, it's very easy, unfortunately, to interrupt that flow.
It is.
Yeah.
In fact, there's a huge economic cost of regaining flow.
Yes.
It might be hours, or you might be done for the day, right? And so, I think the goal of especially security is like to put expertise into the platforms that developers use, so that developers don't have to learn things that they don't need to, that they don't have to break flow.
Right. All right. So now we're on to the third ideal.
Yeah, the third ideal. The third ideal is improvement of daily work. And so this showed up in the Phoenix Project. And this is really on the notion that improvement of daily work is even more important than daily work itself. And I think from a security perspective, I mean, we feel this the most. I mean, when we see technical debt, security debt built up over decades, that is, can actually jeopardize the entire organization. And so, the best known methods now is really you integrate security objectives into daily work. You integrate testing and quality objectives into every stage of daily work. You hold developers responsible for that. I think one of the best examples
is this Microsoft's example where was it Bill Gates that sent the email that said basically if you have an opportunity to improve the security of the code you're working on, that should take priority over everything else.
Absolutely, you're right. In fact, after Code Red, NIMDA, SQL Slammer, Microsoft was at risk of going out of business because Microsoft was considered too dangerous to use in an enterprise. And that led to the famous Trustworthy Computing memo that said exactly what you said, Paul. And so that was the famous feature freeze that said no one works on features. Windows, SQL Server, Office, right, across the entire Microsoft enterprise. They were spending time fixing security issues, finding new security issues, training every developer on secure development. And that is probably one of the most breathtaking examples of transforming a company when there was a sense of genuine existential risk due to security issues.
Fourth ideal.
Fourth ideal is psychological safety. And so my research studying 30,000 plus organizations in the state of DevOps support with Dr. Nicole Forsgren and Jez Humble, we found culture was one of the top predictors of performance. And so I think one of the best examples of bad culture is when where we hide information and we hide bad news because messengers of bad news are shot. We discourage bridging between teams like DevOps and security. But we know that the best cultures are the ones that actively seek information. We train messengers to tell bad news. And we know that bridging between teams is absolutely required because InfoSec is not just InfoSec's job, just like availability isn't just Ops' job, it's everybody's job. And the first line of responsibility are those developers. And so Google also did a study that found that when they spent millions of dollars over years trying to understand what made great teams great. And the top factor they found was psychological safety. To what extent do members on a team feel safe to talk about problems without fear of ridicule, castigation, made to feel stupid,
And
or being blamed.
also, I think fear of like stepping outside their lane, right? Because those silos, it's amazing if left ignored, will form very, very quickly, even in smaller organizations. And once you get to a large organization, then it's a lot of work to break down those silos. But as you said, Gene, the research proves that teams that feel free to work with each other will not only generate more secure applications, but better applications and more quickly.
Absolutely, that's why. And I think that the core of the rebellion, these group of very senior people, the best engineers inside of Parts Unlimited, the fictitious organization depicted in the book, right? They were all somewhat fearless, right, to do the right thing because they knew, what the organization had to do, and that is really embodied in the fifth ideal of customer focus, and just really caring about the end customer, less about the internal processes, internal silos, internal, lines on the org chart. And maybe the other thing that I think is really important, this concept comes from Dr. Geoffrey Moore, is the notion of core versus context.
Yeah, could you explain that? Because I got it in the context of the book, but I really wanted to hear from you that core versus context. And it's not your. You've borrowed from someone else who developed this concept, correct?
Absolutely. In fact, maybe I can just tell a story just because this is such a huge aha moment. So I learned so much from a friend of mine, Dr. Mick Kirsten, he's CEO of TaskTop, and a gentleman named Chris O'Malley, the CEO of CompuWare, the famous mainframe vendor. And so Mick and I, we went to Detroit to spend a day with Chris O'Malley. And as we were walking to the building, I'm looking at the agenda, and I immediately felt embarrassed because the first thing on the agenda was a data center tour. And I'm telling Mick, I'm like, I don't know why we're going to get a data center tour. I'm so sorry. I'm not sure what we're going to learn by looking at fire extinguishers. But it was amazing because you walk into the data center and it was empty. There was 2 Z mainframes, and then there was 100,000 square feet of empty floor space of where the server racks used to be. And on the floor were these green outlines of where the racks were, and in the middle was of each one of the squares were a tombstone that described what application used to be there and how much money they saved by getting rid of it.
So you really did see that
awesome.
in real life.
That's awesome.
Absolutely, right. And so also there was a person who spent, before he's, got rid of it all over, many years, spent a decade putting this stuff in, right? And so that was a very hard thing. And so the value of doing that was they were able to reallocate $8 million of context and plow it into core. So definitions. Core are the core competencies of the organization, the things that customers value that create lasting, durable business advantage. Context is everything else. So it may be mission critical, but it's not what customers pay for. So payroll systems, cafeteria point of sale systems, right? The email system and so forth, right? Important, but customers actually don't care about it. And so by getting rid of all that, allowed them to spend $8 million more on R&D, which customers do care about that. And so I think this is so important because what Dr. Geoffrey Moore wrote about is that in so many organizations, context starves core, right? And so, I think it's a very important thing for every engineer, as like engineers are making the most important technology and business decisions for an organization, to really kind of keep that in mind.
Now, I think one thing they need to do in that story is that they need to do a virtual environment so that you can take a virtual tour of the data center, so they can realize even more cost savings by reclaiming the space that the tombstones are taking.
Right? That'd be a pretty cool virtual tour, right?
I mean, you saved all the money on decommissioning all of that hardware, but now you've retained the floor space for the tombstones where it used to live. Turn it into offices or cubicles.
Right. Now, Gene, you also reference a sensei in there, and I apologize, I don't remember. Can you tell our audience about that and how you came about his work?
Yeah, so there were many of them. Are you talking about Eric in the book?
Yeah,
or,
Eric. Eric's reference.
Eric, so Eric showed up in the Phoenix Project as this kind of Yoda-like character who kind of speaks in kind of cryptic ways. And so that's a kind of a classic trope in movies, right? Yoda, who is super powerful and yet refuses to give direct answers. And so Eric does show up in the Unicorn Project, and I was stunned. I was on a plane on airplane Wi-Fi when I saw your tweet that you actually discovered who Eric was before it was announced, before the big reveal, and I burst out laughing because no, I didn't think anyone would have done that. That's amazing.
I was screaming I knew it in my car. And my kids were like, what are you talking about, Dad?
Yeah, that was quite, as an author, I was quite proud of that in the Phoenix Project, right? Is that, like in the famous scene in Empire Strikes Back when you first meet Yoda, right? It comes off as sort of a buffoon, can't be a primary character, right? And it turns out to be the hope of the universe. So I did enjoy in the Phoenix Project, trying to pull that off. And I was hoping to have done that in the Unicorn Project as well. And I think for 98% of the people, they will not have picked up nearly as quickly as you did.
And so Eric now references these senseis, right?
Yeah.
And I since you're coming on, I meant to research them, but I want to know where you got these references from because they're pretty cool.
Oh yeah, there's some of my favorite authorities in the fields of physical safety, of lean, of people who pioneer technical practices. So whenever you see sensei attached to an authority, they're real, and it's a way just to elevate them across other lesser authorities, right? Because I think they're really central to what I think is going to. I think they'll be some of the most powerful influences in the next century of management practices. And just a little trivia fact for you: in the Phoenix Project, in my drafts, there was always a sensei for a group of people that, again, sort of rose that level, but it was actually taken out in one of the last stages of editing, and I only discovered it after the book went to print. And I just kind of freaked out because I thought it was so important. It turns out that it actually bothers some people, so I never put it back in. But for very few people know that that sensei treatment of certain authorities was supposed to be in the Phoenix Project as well.
Interesting. So the senseis are real people, but not actually practicing martial artists necessarily. They're referred to as
it's just a
moniker.
Right?
It's a moniker, right?
Yeah, exactly.
It was pretty cool. So what are the three horizons?
Oh, the three horizons. Yeah, it comes from. It was popularized again by Dr. Geoffrey Moore's book Zones to Win.
You bet. Don't go away. I want to see if I can get a word with the.
Sorry, Lee, you're not muted.
I am not paying attention.
I think Lee clicked the button. He had some guests in the studio who was showing what podcasting was all about.
Right. I think someone wanted to check out Gene's interview.
My apologies.
Live. No worries, Lee.
No worries, Lee.
So sorry, Gene. The three horizons.
Yeah. The three horizons. Another thing that comes out of Dr. Geoffrey Moore's work. Actually, it came from a McKinsey study before that, but it's great. It basically says in any organization there are typically three categories of operations, and as he calls them, horizons. Horizon one are the successful business lines, often doing billions of dollars of annual revenue, probably sustained over decades. So predictable, great organizations. And Horizon two are the ones where we're taking kind of the core offerings, we're offering them to adjacent markets. And so, maybe those are the $100 million lines of business. And then they come from the Horizon 3 areas, which are the ones that are more like startups, where there's a huge amount of, we might not know who the customer is or what the market looks like or what the technology requirements are. I think it's easily argued that, yes, Horizon 3 efforts are what turned into Horizon 2 efforts, and what Horizon 2 are turned into Horizon 1s. And what is so remarkable about that, it really shows that you really do need a different culture in each one, right? The Horizon 1, usually you do need a lot of process. You have a lot of rules because you need kind of these resilient structures to, sustain greatness over decades. Whereas in Horizon 3, right, that's what kills Horizon 3. As startups don't have a lot of rules. You have a lot of boundary spanning, very ambiguous roles and responsibilities at times. And so I just love the three horizons as a way to, one, define why these innovations or efforts are important, and two, just really cast just say bluntly, why we need different cultures the old ways won't always work, and why sometimes the old ways must die.
Yeah, and I think the challenge at the end of the day is a Horizon 1 has a lot of difficulty with Horizon 2 and Horizon 3 types of initiatives because they are so
rigid.
Rigid and proselytized, where it's hard to enable those cultures to create Horizon 2 and Horizon 3 kind of entities, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Yeah, in fact, there's a whole body of literature that says that you really can't. So the Innovator's Dilemma was all about that, right? That Horizon 1 will kill Horizon 3 activities because they view it as competition, both for internal resources, for customers, right? There was a great book called The Other Side of Innovation by Dr. Govindarajan and Dr. Chris Trimble that actually said, by studying the BMW electric car project, the Wall Street Journal first online offering, the first trail running shoe at Timberline. I mean, they said the first small tractor line at John Deere. They said the only way that you can do these innovative efforts is by putting them outside of Horizon 1 to protect it. And it needs to be typically led by someone who spent a lot of time in Horizon 1. Otherwise, like, no one will respect that person. No one will give them an inch. And it's just to your point. I mean, that's right on. And I think the common, there's a lot of literature that absolutely supports that intuition.
Gene, sci-fi fans won't be disappointed as to the references. I got Lord of the Rings, Star Wars, and Star Trek. Did I miss any other similar types of references in there?
I think you got the visible ones. And just so you know, kind of my internal model for the book was the red shirts from Star Trek.
Yep.
The A-Team, Hogan's Heroes, and the movie Brazil, where the number one fugitive in the movie was the rogue air conditioner repairman who would break into people's apartments and fix their air conditioning because central services wouldn't. And so I think it's really meant to embody kind of these amazing efforts I've seen in the DevOps enterprise community, where you have these kind of fearless leaders, these pirates, these rebels who, really are brave enough to break the rules. And although they may get people angry, in the short term, in the long term, everyone is grateful, and these people are being promoted, being lauded for creating real material value for the organization.
All right, now I'm excited because if you're listening to this and you don't want to hear spoilers, fast forward to the end because we're going to delve into spoilers. All right, I'll give you a moment. Spoiler alert.
Spoiler alert.
My theory, Gene, and I'm curious to get your feedback on this, that all along, Eric was behind Maxine's assignment to the Phoenix Project, knowing that she would be the savior of that project. So he engineered her reassignment to the Phoenix Project.
Man, I must be honest. That never occurred to me. But I will say that there should be no doubt that when Eric is running the dockside bar and he's kind of he knows that Kurt is onto something as the leader of the rebellion, and when he sees Maxine show up, he immediately knows that the last missing puzzle piece has arrived.
Right.
So
he knows that she's like, she's like the Luke or the hero in the story, right? My theory was that Eric, being the bartender, overhearing their conversations, was like, oh, I heard of Maxine. If I get her reassigned to this project, this rebellion thing is going to take off a lot faster.
It's interesting. You're making me think about the book because he actually does know who Maxine is and her background. But yeah, it didn't actually occur to me to actually have Eric engineer it.
Right. Now, is Eric
a crappy thing to do?
Is Eric a Force ghost or is he a real person? Because when you first when we first figure out it's Eric and stuff, I'm like, is this character really real? He does feel like, you mentioned Yoda before, he does feel very much like that, that Yoda or that Obi-Wan that comes in and kind of gives this really kind of riddled wisdom and then kind of disappears, right? Just like the Force ghost, you will go to the Dagobah system and train,
right? Yeah, someone asked, how do I find a mentor like Eric? And, my answer is, you don't want a mentor like Eric, right? Eric doesn't care enough. Eric, if someone really cared, they wouldn't disappear at the critical moment when you need their help, right? That's that's not how friends behave with each other, right?
Right.
So, but I think kind of the classical characteristic of that trope is kind of an indifference to outcome. And I think all of us, really do want to be like Eric. Is I think, at least in my case, there are many people I admire who have this. They're incredibly passionate, but they also have a certain indifference to outcome where, because they have so many options, they are willing to do very fearless things because, they don't need the job. They don't need they don't feel beholden to put up with any crap. So
Right.
I think
Yeah.
Eric definitely had that.
And I think what's great is that the Steve personas really need that Eric, right, to kind of come in at certain moments and reassure and apply wisdom to their teams. That like, if that was Steve doing that, like, people would be like, no, that's not. I'm not gonna who are you to say that, right? But when Eric comes in, people sometimes don't understand, of course, what Eric's saying, but they do listen and try to understand and take action upon what Eric is saying. Whereas if that was Steve, it's different. Steve's the CEO, right?
Yeah, and for your own for your amusement, believe it or not, I mean, I wrote about 130. So the Unicorn Project is about 110,000 words, and my first draft was about 130, 140,000. With the intent of editing it down.
Mm-hmm.
So all the Eric scenes actually came at the end, right? It's basically kind of after, kind of really distilling the 5 ideals, then. It really became Eric's job to teach the 5 ideals. So believe it or not, Eric kind of shows up in the writing process. It was actually the Eric scenes that were added last.
Right, right. To instill those 5 ideals.
Yeah.
It sounds like a good strategy role.
Yeah.
Right,
It is,
a strategy guy comes in, gives the vision, where we're going, then walks away and lets somebody else deliver on it.
It's very much
good strategy.
Now, this one's kind of funny. I mean, had you considered Maxine running over Sarah with her car as opposed to having lunch with her? Because I was kind of rooting for that at certain points.
So interesting. I've gotten more comments about that last scene where Sarah ends up going, Maxine goes to lunch with Sarah.
Yeah.
And the cryptic comment is it wasn't what she expected, and she might look forward to the next meeting. Because a couple of people said they were so glad that there was some possibility of a Sarah redemption, that maybe Sarah wasn't actually a bad actor. Maybe Sarah wasn't actively inherently a bad person. Maybe she too was trying to do what she thought was best
right.
for the organization.
Yeah.
And one of the funny things I plan on doing is recording a podcast episode with some people I really respect. One of them is Elizabeth Henderson, who was at Pivotal for many years, and Peter Moore, actually the brother of Dr. Geoffrey Moore. And Elizabeth Henderson, we were having a very similar conversation. She said, what is Sarah's background?
Yeah.
And when we were having lunch, and I almost sort of spit out my drink, because every one of the characters I've written backgrounds for. I've written their resume. I've written their kind of life history, right? I never did that for Sarah. So
Interesting.
I didn't actually know. Kind of,
but I think the lesson to take away from Sarah truly is more of a social one, is that sometimes there is a person like Sarah that you work with that you really truly don't like. It doesn't mean they're a bad person, right? After the dust settles, you can go out to lunch and realize that they're not a bad person. We were just both kind of in this situation and had different perspectives, but that doesn't make them a bad person.
So wise. Yeah, in fact, that is exactly right. And I think kind of that scene was really meant to kind of create a path to be able to explore that. And so one of the things that we talked about was, all right, what is Sarah's background? And so what came together was, I think she came from I think she's a phenomenal merchandising person. She's good at strategy, right? So if you look at her books, she reads a lot of strategy books, but she's definitely not a people person.
Right.
She's not a great leader.
Correct.
Her favorite book is probably Who Moved My Cheese, right?
I was actually describing that book to someone today.
I was just recommending that book to our staff today.
I said I had a Who Moved My Cheese moment. I was late for a meeting because I had gotten back from karate, and I had to change out of my gi, and somebody moved my pants.
Right?
So who moved my pants?
Yeah.
Who moved my gi?
Right. Now, Gene, in the next book, have you considered having Brent, Maxine, Cranky Dave, Tom, and Kurt to leave and create their own startup?
The startup project.
I love the idea, but I guess my area of passion is really about how large, complex organizations are transforming. I mean, I think that's where, I think that's what's going to mark the next 10 years is when, organizations have been around for decades or centuries adopt all the practices that were pioneered at the Facebooks, Amazon, Netflix, and Googles and Microsofts. And there's no doubt in my mind that will generate more economic value than was ever created by the FANGs. And there's 18 million developers on the planet, of which maybe 3% are working in a DevOps-like way. So the idea that you have, we're going to unleash 18 million more developers, right, and elevate the productivity by a factor of 100 or 1,000. I mean, that is so exciting to me. So, startups are cool. I've certainly lived one through the Tripwire experience. And by the way, I loved the episode that you did with Doug Song. I think what a phenomenal episode that was. So startups are cool. They're great. But I'm very grateful to my experience. But my heart is really in the large, complex organizations.
And it's too bad because startups they have their own set of challenges.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
Because we see this all the time in our industry. Yeah. Gene, where you take the best talent, and they leave and they do a startup, and then they run into a whole other set of challenges that could benefit the broader
And I think
community.
you both kind of answered my question as to why the rebellion decides to stay, right? Because when you read the book, I'm like, wow, these folks are really frustrated with their jobs. I'm like, are they all just going to up and quit and go do their own thing? But they really do want to stay and make it work, which I don't know how often that happens in the real world, maybe more often than I've experienced, right? But they decide to stay, which I think is interesting.
Just a little data point on that. I think one of the most amazing examples of that, I think from kind of the worst to first, is Microsoft. Someone made the observation during the Steve Ballmer era, the stock price was essentially flat, right? Meaning, rather, the market cap was flat. Same as when he left when he arrived. And under Satya Nadella is now the world's most valuable company. And so, and I think if you take a look at the internal employee engagement scores, about their optimism for the company, I mean, it is like a night and day story. And so I'd like to think that, I think it is the fact that technology organizations inside of most large complex organizations are some of the worst, have the worst employee engagement across all the other functional silos. And I'd love to think, right, that, they can be as happy and as productive and get as much sense of meaning out of their work than anybody else. And so that's one of my hopes for the book, is to really show how that's possible and the roles that the most senior leaders in the company have to make that happen. If the developers are some of the most important people in the organization in this era of digital disruption, then they have to make that happen.
Right. And so what advice do you have for those in that situation that are staging a rebellion or considering staging right? Because you could easily read this and be in similar situations and go, I should stage a rebellion, right? Is that the right answer?
In fact, I did get some really great feedback during the review process saying, hey, look, you've got to put some advice in here because otherwise you're going to get a bunch of reckless, people with poor judgment doing terrible things. And so I think I did make sure to add some lines about hey, Kurt could get fired for doing this. Kurt knows the risk he's taking. He knows how little air cover he has. And so I think the advice I would give is, especially if you are, actually to everybody, is if you know what the right thing to do is for the organization, for the customers, for your teammates, and if you can't get permission and the budget, do it anyway, right?
Right.
So that you have something to show other people, right? And I think if you're a manager and you can't get budget or approval to do it, you hide the capacity and you do it anyway, right? Because you need those wins to prove that you're right. And I think that is at the core of every successful rebellion I've studied in the DevOps enterprise community. And these people are being promoted, right? When people see what they've done, they say, do more of it.
Yeah. Well, it's very purposeful, right? They're not breaking the rules necessarily. They're bending. It's very hackerish, right? They're bending the rules. They're not going completely rogue and causing disruption or whatever. They're trying to get their job done, bending the rules to do so in this rebellion, and to Gene's point, for reward, to help the company get to the next level and to accomplish something, which I think had some.
But I also think it's a very delicate balance between values, your values and what you think are right to do, versus do you feel that you still have purpose and the ability to execute, right? That's a very interesting balance in these types of scenarios, right? Is what the right thing to do is for the customer, but if you're not getting the support, do you feel that you're providing that value back to the organization? That's a delicate balance for humans, I think, to have.
But it's great in the Maxine character in that she could have chose to listen to what she was told. She could go to the Phoenix Project. She was told to lay low, do your thing. Don't draw a lot of attention to yourself. Don't go outside of your lane, right? And that's one of the reasons why I love the Maxine character, because she's a total hacker. She's like, screw that. I can't get anything done. I can't even get a build going. I mean, she takes, almost 2 weeks? 2 weeks to get a build going on her laptop. And she's like, this is ludicrous. I'm really good at this, and I can't get it done. And so then she finds the rebellion and people who are willing to help her and work together to get things done. And that's when it's a positive thing versus like breaking all of the rules and causing more of a disruption, right?
Yeah, in fact, what I love about, I think that's what I really try to frame in the fifth ideal is that, so often in large organizations, no one sees the customer goals or the organizational mission. They only see the silo goals.
Right.
So it's not my job, right,
Yeah.
to worry about your problems.
Not my
and
problem.
I think so it's not so much about the values of the organization. It's about the values of the silo, right? And,
Yeah. Jeff, you have a question?
Well, yes, I do have a question. Since we're a security show, I am curious as to, and I apologize, I haven't read all the books that I'm supposed to have read, but I don't read any books. So
Jeff, you're out of the book club.
I was telling Paul when I was in the studio last week, I think I'm going to have to break down and do audiobooks because I just never had the time to pick up a book. All that said, and the answer may well be within the pages that you've written, Gene, but I am just curious, what is the place in the new world for security within the context of Phoenix, Unicorn, DevOps, but mostly DevOps?
It's a great question.
Yeah. So I actually talked to a friend. His name is Tomer Gershoni. He was the chief product security officer for HP, and he said something that just blew me away. He said, in security, we often are in our GRC tools, and that's where we put all. That's our system of record. And he said, and yet, if a ticket doesn't exist in Jira, it might as well not exist. And it just, for me, it was like this, blow to the forehead that said it's so true, right? It's if it is in those development teams where value is being created and is where the work is generated, where the work must be completed, and this just shows that where security belongs is inside of those product teams. Whether it's embedded in them directly, because we must hold them responsible for the outcomes of what they produce. And I think security moves to a more coaching consulting role. If we're not part of those teams, then we're actively, going to every one of their demos, their iteration reviews, and we are, teaching, coaching, helping. And it is a much. And at first, I think I laughed at that concept because it was so informal. But I think it is that informality that makes things work, because that behavior is one of friends helping each other, of colleagues helping each other, as opposed to, the ritual we go through where, we go through the annual security review or the review right before the deployment. And then my goal as a security person is to, catch you doing something bad, right? And
right, and it's interesting. What I think Gene instills confidence in the story is that there's both the kind of external compliance focused security, which is very important, especially in the context of the business that's fictitious business that's in the story. But there's also Shannon, the security person, who's part of the rebellion. And so there's certain points where it's questioned, and they're like, well, we have Shannon on the team. She's watching out for security, right? And so the other external security groups like, all right, that's cool. Like, you have Shannon. That's a model that I had not seen explored in a lot of other things that we've read and learned from doing interviews on the show, is that we kind of push security into the functional groups and say, well, it shouldn't be this overarching thing. But in the story, it's interesting. It's really both.
Yeah, actually, I have this story that is very prone to misinterpretation, but I mean, it was such one of the most startling things I've ever heard. It came from, again, Elizabeth Henderson, who actually came from a quality background, and she was talking about this group called the Los Altos Software Workshop for Testing, for software testing, and they did 60 workshops over a decade. And one of the exercises they did was among this group of like 50 people, the best QA people in the game. What was your dev QA ratio for your best project and your worst project? And she said something really unexpected came up, is that when people said for the worst projects, it was the ones with the highest dev QA ratios, like sometimes 1-to-1 ratio of dev and QA. It's like, okay, that's interesting, but that's not as interesting as what came up next. For people's best projects, the most common answer was no security people, no QA people, right? So these are QA professionals. And she said the big aha moment for her was you end up with the best quality outcomes when everybody knows that there's no other group out there who are going to find your problems.
Yeah. That's really
when you care
point.
a lot about it.
Right.
Yeah. So I think the implication for security is equally evident, right? Is that we're going to get the best security when there is no one out there who's going to find your security issues for you, right? It is your job, right? So I think
it's an interesting notion. Lee.
So based on what you're saying, I'm sorry, Lee.
Go ahead, Jeff.
Let me finish my thought, if I may.
Go ahead.
So based on what you're saying, it needs to be within DevOps. Whatever we call security people needs to teach, coach, mentor, dare I say, Jedi mind trick. I guess my thought just on what you were just saying is, yeah, that's great if they're the only ones that are going to look for anything wrong from a security perspective. But in my experience, I like to caveat my statements with this. They don't generally know it. So I guess it goes back to your statement. We have to infuse security into the people that are doing DevOps so that they are, so it becomes part of their DNA. I think that's what you're saying. So hopefully reading the book will help people down that path, right?
Yeah, I absolutely, and I would hope. And I think there's actually another important role for the security guild, right? Is that they're going to put their best expertise into the platforms that developers use, so that alongside Jenkins and CI systems and automated testing are going to be the security tests, right? So we can do static analysis and DAST and all the things that we do, but it's going to be integrated into what developers use every day. And so the issues that security finds will show up right alongside, the testing issues and the performance issues that they look at every day. So developers aren't going to build that. Security people have to.
Yeah, but if the operational aspects of security are built into the pipeline, then the broader security role plays governance, compliance, and other aspects that maybe aren't kind of in that portion, and it becomes kind of a split responsibility. Is that the operational aspects of securing code is kind of integrated into the pipeline, so it's in the hands of the developers to build that DNA. But then there's still in this book, there's still that kind of that overarching entity in place that's still looking at all the other pieces and in all the other aspects of security.
It's interesting, Gene. Right? And Matt, I think it has an interface into dev and also ops, right? And I'm reminded that there's a scene in the book where it's Black Friday, right? And there's just this enormous server load that they have to endure, and there's like newly developed and deployed applications. But when I think about it now in this context of Jeff and Matt's questions, right, that could very well be a security event. And really, operationally and procedurally, like, what's the difference, right? Like, we're monitoring, watching for an event, and responding accordingly. This happened to be a known event. Often security, the difference is it's not a known event, it's an unexpected event, but the resulting operational processes and investigations are very similar to, we need more capacity here, we need to open up a firewall rule there, we need to expand the database here, and things like that.
I think Lee had a
love
question.
the way you said it. Actually, can I make one observation on that?
Go ahead,
I
Gene.
think your observation is right on. I mean, my friend Charlie Betts, he had a really great observation that, at that higher level, the time frames are much longer, right? It's like you have to write contracts so that you can figure out how to fulfill them for decades to come. Security, I think, in that role is similar, right? How do we make sure that we follow and don't break any covenants around data and contractual obligations and regulations, right? So it very much is a longer game that is so. We don't want the teams mired in that, right? These teams might even disappear. At that higher level, we're really thinking about longer term obligations, to our customers, to the organization.
Right. Yeah. That's why I call it a governance role. But yes. Yeah.
I have a question, but I think Lee had a question first.
So the question I had was, We talk about the semi-adversarial role of the security team, and why is it that that maintains? I mean, I know with we're talking about DevOps, they're using all the wrong tools because they aren't the cliche tried and trusted 20-year-old ones, but is the security team unwilling to learn? I mean, why would that remain in that? Why wouldn't they partner easily? It seems weird. Or am I the one that's weird?
Yeah, no. I think you're. What a great question. I mean, I think what's amazing is that like you have this rebellion, right, of the kind of the people who are not willing to look at doing ways that are not always the way we've done it. Maybe their philosophy is make tomorrow better than today, right? And yet everyone else is like. Yeah, that's crazy, right? That's not the way we've done it. And it's not just security; it's operations, it's QA, development, product management, and I think it's actually a bell curve of people's to what degree are they comfortable with what might look like chaos. And I think what eventually, in fact, the whole Geoffrey Moore thing about innovators. Early adopters, early majority, late majority, and laggards. I mean, that really is a Gaussian distribution of people. And what the drivers are at the innovators and early adopters, they're doing it for competitive advantage, right? It's interesting. I see a better way of doing things. Early majority is they're doing it to get promoted. Late majority is they're doing it not to get fired. And laggards are the ones who got fired, right? So, I think it's just a part of human nature. And it's universal. It's not just security. It is everywhere.
Got it.
It's interesting, though. I think there's a scene in the book, Gene, that because there's a security person on the team advising, there's a meeting with security at a certain critical point. And is it Dwayne that's the other security person? And they're like really nervous. They're like, security's never going to bless this. And Shannon's like, no, we got this, right? And it gets blessed because security's built into their rebellion process from the beginning because Shannon, the security person, is on the rebellion, right?
Yeah. In fact, there's another scene where they didn't get permission, right? And the security person says, hey, I can't let you jump the queue because there's 20 other people in front of you. They'll jump down my throats if I let you go first. He says, this is not my decision. This is a business. This is a decision that needs to be made by the business. And Shannon freaks out. She's like, they're not the business. They're not our customers. They're our colleagues, right? Yeah. We're the business, right? And we are the first line of like who's actually responsible to fulfill security objectives. So I do. I think that is a mistake. Sometimes we actually we manufacture this us versus them, right? It's their decision, right? And when that too is can be a very convenient fiction we create for ourselves.
Jeff.
First, a comment and then a question. Clearly, this is a work of fiction because I've never met an organization where security could actually stop a project.
Wow.
My question though is there a message or what can an organization or people that work in an organization take away from this book if DevOps isn't part of their their business, if they're not in the business of designing and building technology things, is there something that translates into a non DevOps world?
Yeah, I love one of my favorite definitions of DevOps comes from John Smart. He was the head of the Better Ways of Working at Barclays, and now he's a partner at Deloitte. And he said, our goal is to deliver better value, sooner, safer, happier. BVSSH. Better value, sooner, safer, happier. And there's like it's such a wonderful and disarming definition because like there's nothing to really object to. It's like, okay, are you objecting to it because of better, faster, safer, or happier? Right? It's like there's you would actually have to be a bad person like to not want that, and so it does kind of change the dynamic of like, okay, our goal is to deliver value faster or safer in the case of security, right? Or and then outcome is that we actually have more engaged employees.
And they're using SSH, so what security person wouldn't like that, right?
Right.
What could go wrong?
I love it. That never occurred to me. Although SSH just should rightly scare many people. That scares me.
Well, I think it's interesting, Gene, because you could read this book and say, like the opposite of to Jeff's question, like, I want to deliver crappier code and insecure and slower, right? Like, nobody wants that. Whatever processes get you to better, safer, and faster, whether it's DevOps or something else, I really think, having read the book, and it's about how you break down those silos and get things done within your organization, despite the way things have been in the past. A newer process, whether it's DevOps or some deviation, just breaking down those silos, being able to get things done so it's deployed faster, it's secure, and it actually works and serves our customers. So what's Steve's line in the book? It's like, we need to provide parts to our customers so that they can drive to work every day and pick up their kids, right? He has that like quintessential CEO like tagline that's just reinforced in the book, which is hilarious in a certain sense.
And by the way, I love what you just said, because I think it's very funny to me that one of those when you say that security has never stopped anything, because I think when the Phoenix Project, the most memorable character for many was John, the security CISO, who like wouldn't let anything get done. Right? I mean, his he was famous for saying no to everything. And
it sounds like he hasn't changed much, though. Like, he went through kind of a drinking binge in the Phoenix Project, but like in the Unicorn Project, he's kind of maybe still got some of his old ways of saying no, right?
It's the same timeline, Paul.
Yeah.
It's the same timeline.
And I just love the way you frame that, Paul, because I think this is a language that security we should use to help make the case. It's like, I'm going to help you go faster and be safer, right, and be happier in the meantime, right? And I think that will I think in the eyes of many, this will be a totally new person, right, in the security function, because they'll never have seen anyone who talks like that before, and it's so effective and disarming.
And I think sorry, Jeff, real quick, just humorous comment. I think that you mentioned that, Paul, that you say no one ever wants to give slower, more insecure code, crappier, any of that type of stuff. No one wants it, but many times that's what they do.
Yeah. No, you're right there. Yeah.
But they do that because they've got other drivers or perceived drivers where they feel like they need to do that. I forgot what my witty. No, go ahead.
And that's not healthy either, right? It's like when you have like crazy product managers who are saying features. We're going to do whatever it takes to like not lose this customer or whatever, and we don't concentrate on long-term viability of the code base or how we actually fulfill the category goals instead of the customer goals. Right. I mean, that's actually a great place. And, for security to help that says, hey, look, and even internal audit. I heard there was a gentleman from who spoke at DevOps Enterprise. He said, hey, if it would be helpful, we could create an audit finding, just to create the budget and create this awareness that, there's some very unhealthy behaviors happening within that feature team. I mean, so like what?
Gene, don't underestimate the power of PCI.
It does come into play, and I think the Parts Unlimited example is a good example that you chose, Gene, for the book. Was there folks in kind of like automotive parts or similar industries that you drew from? Because it does provide a really good example for all the things we're talking about, right? Like process and DevOps and security and product management and mobile apps and back-end systems, right? And older companies that were servicing cars, right? And cars have been around for a while, where you may have that legacy company, right? It was a great setting for the story.
Yeah, is it really meant to be? The setting was in the Phoenix Project was meant to be kind of a company that was the opposite of a Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, or Google, right? It really meant to be the every company, and that was so much drawn on my research studying technology organizations, for 20 years, and nothing makes me happy when people say, "Oh my God, reading the book was like." I was having flashbacks, or like it felt like you were hiding in our office for the last 5 years. It's like you described meetings I've been in for the last month. So it just says, when I hear that, I love it, just because it says that there was some accurate capture of reality, right?
And a shining example of that, as great as Maxine is in this book, when she gets to using Git, she's like, I gotta go read and consult the manual. I'm like, yes, I'm not alone. I'm not alone.
It is hard, right? In fact, someone, my friend Mick Kirsten, right? He said, name another tool that uses SHA-1 hashes in their UI.
Yeah, right. There's a lot of points like that, like reverse engineering the ODBC driver, right? Like I was early in my career, not reversing. I had the source code, right? Thankfully, my job was a little easier, but I had to like rewrite a driver for a new platform, and that's a serious, challenging engineering problem, right? And to like build up the Maxine character, she famously reverse engineers that ODBC driver, but quickly she realizes that other people in the rebellion have done the same thing and instantly earns her respect, which I thought was something that we all have seen and experienced in our careers as well.
It could have been a bank as well, because banks have some
absolutely.
Of this
Absolutely.
Stuff too,
right. Now, also a kumquat server. Is that based on a real technology, Gene?
I can't say. It's
because there is a Ruby on Rails project that is called Kumquat server. I wasn't sure if it was the same thing that you're referencing in the book.
Let's just say there are some middleware products and some database products that people just hate.
Sure.
And in fact, the one Kumquat server it's like a 20-year-old OS, and it takes a day it takes 8 hours to reboot. So rebooting the cluster could take a day.
Yeah. But we've all been there, right? Like we've all experienced systems like that. So that's real too. Now also, like people sleep with each other. But now, did Steve and Sarah have an affair? That's my question.
No, that was categorically put to rest as a negative in the Phoenix project. So
I was just kind of hoping for it. I mean, different people. I mean, it turns out Kurt is married to someone else in the organization, right? So there are
HR first.
I like to, but I like to tease people that like there are people sleeping with each other in the book because it's like, ooh, is it like Steve and Sarah? But like it's totally like they're married and it's totally cool kind of thing, right?
Also, a work of fiction. Married people don't have sex. Just kidding.
Yeah, that's a great point, Jeff. That's a great point, actually.
What was fun and rewarding to explore was like, why does Sarah act the way she does, and just the notion of an outside board member, potentially kind of dangling this road to a CEO, right,
Yep.
and showing what the compensation structure might be for shrinking the company, splitting it apart. I mean, I did get a lot of delight out of hinting at that.
But that's a very real thing I thought was worked into the story, right? Plausible.
Yeah, and the idea that Sarah shows up as the villain from the previous book and shows up again with even more powerful allies. I mean, I loved it. I was like, yes.
Oh, it's like Empire. It's like an ode to Empire Strikes Back, right?
Right. One of my favorite quotes came from a mutual friend of ours, Chris Porter, who's CISO at Fannie Mae. He said one of the feedback that he gave was, just when I thought I couldn't hate Sarah more.
Right? You do. You definitely hate her. You definitely hate her more.
Hey, I have a quick comment for Gene. I would like to make a pledge, and I'd like our co-host to join me in the pledge. I promise, if a copy of the Unicorn Project just showed up in my mailbox, magically signed, I will read it.
Easily done. In fact, I promise to you and all your illustrious co-hosts that that will happen. That's easy.
Sweet.
Awesome.
Thank you.
I've already listened to it, but I would make a shrine to a signed copy in my office.
It may end up as set decoration at some point.
Yeah, set decoration.
We could do that.
We can frame it. We'll frame it.
I did. Obviously, I thoroughly enjoyed both the Phoenix Project and the Unicorn Project. In fact, I just tasked my team again to make sure that they've read the Phoenix Project. Now, what's interesting, I don't know, we're like way over time, but whatever. In any case, you get a lot out of the Phoenix Project, and you have to read that before you listen to Beyond the Phoenix Project. And what I tell folks is that I got more out of the Beyond the Phoenix Project than I did the Phoenix Project. But you have to read the Phoenix Project in order to have that kind of realization. So for my folks that are not necessarily in development, right? I mean, our production staff here is very much in the manufacturing process of podcasts and shows, right? And like, this is required reading for you folks, right? Because it very much mirrors that kind of manufacturing process that can be applied to many different processes. To me, the Unicorn Project was definitely more about development, breaking down silos, digital transformation, which is great, right? But the Phoenix and the Beyond the Phoenix project definitely applies to any type of process that needs to iterate and be under heavy load and need to be highly efficient.
Yeah,
Did I capture that,
great.
Gene?
Yeah, I love that, and boy, I love hearing that. It means so much to me. And I think for me, I would just be really happy if people read the Unicorn Project and have a reaction of like, "Hey, I'm not in development, but wow, I finally understand what those developers do. I can now understand how to better to relate to them and how I can even help them." And so I did get I read somewhere about a famous author wrote kind of the worst possible book to write is the Ensign's Guide to the Starship Enterprise, where all they do is marvel at the dilithium crystals and the phasers and the technical reference manuals.
Right.
And sometimes I felt like I might be falling into that trap with the Unicorn Project. But I'm really pleased with the way it turned out, because the goal is really to show the absurdities that engineers have to do to solve business problems, and I hope it's accessible to even people who aren't even remotely working with developers on a daily basis.
Wait, did you just say Star Trek is an absurdity?
No.
Them's fighting words.
But it very much does have a happy ending. I was kind of hoping for people to shuffle differently, but I thought that the distinguished engineer title for Maxine was a very fitting ending, to the story. So it was awesome.
But the Star Trek would be absurd if you had to fill out forms and get approval boards to do everything, to even beam down to the planet, right?
Right.
Like,
yes. Absolutely. Any final questions for Gene? Gene, anything else you wanted to highlight for our audience in this context?
Oh, it's been a delight spending this time with you. Thank you for having me on, Paul. It's been many years. And by the way, if you enjoyed this, then by all means, check out the Doug Song episode, because I thought that was freaking awesome. And yeah, if anyone wants to reach me, probably the best way is on Twitter. I'm just hit me at Real Gene Kim on Twitter, and I will respond to you as fast as I can.
And
Awesome.
not the fake Gene Kim.
Real Gene Kim. That's right.
Real Gene Kim.
Gene, thank you so much for appearing on Paul Security Weekly.
Thank you so much, guys, and catch you next time.
With that, we'll take a short break, come back. Fabulous technical segment on Python backdoors with Peter Smith from Edgewise. Stay tuned.